Hello everyone, welcome to Easy Economics. How are you all doing? I hope you all are doing good. Well, today I brought for you all a brand new series for past paper solving. Today the paper I brought for you all is November 2025, question paper 210455. We're going to be doing section A today. Let's quickly dive to what the question has brought for us today. Now, usually the format which I follow is I read the case study first, the source material first, before answering the questions. It's entirely up to you how you want to go about answering the question. However, first, I would go about reading the source material and then I would go about reading the questions. So let's try to comprehend the question together. Now, they've given us a table. They're talking about the Swiss economy, they're talking about the Switzerland's economy. And the fact file they've given is the first, they talk about the population, which was 8.7 million in 2022. The inflation rate was 3.5%. The GDP at that time was $808 billion. The total contribution made by the financial sector towards the GDP was around 9%. The current account was having a surplus of around $78 billion. Now, although they are saying that the inflation in Switzerland was above its target of 2%, it was below the inflation rate of high income economies. That means that Switzerland had kept a target of 2%, however, the inflation was 3.5%, but still it was able to have an inflation rate lower than the highly income countries, highly earning income countries at that time, such as the US, that was 9.1%, experiencing inflation of 9.1%, UK was having 11.1%, Germany was having 7.9%. Now, they're saying the reason why Switzerland was able to have such stability in its price levels was because it had ensured that it implemented a combination of both micro and macroeconomic policies. Now, we know microeconomic policies, which means what? Governing particular sectors or particular industries of the economy, and macroeconomic means that it had enforced policies that covered the entire economy. That means the economy at large. Now, what are the policies under each? It said maximum prices, subsidies, and contractionary monetary policies. So, maximum prices and subsidies can be what? Micro. And contractionary monetary policy means that it's talking about macro policies. Right? Contractionary monetary policy is what? When you reduce the money supply and then you increase the interest rate. Right? So, let's see what it further says. Further down, it says to encourage the production of solar energy, the government has provided more than $500 million in subsidies to producers. Now, it wanted the economy to rely more on solar energy systems. That means renewable energy sources. Why? Because this was a part of the government's plan to move away from non-renewable sources of energy, which was mainly imported. That means it wanted to cut down on its imports of non-renewable energy resources. And in order to do that, it started promoting solar energy production by giving subsidies to its producers, and already $500 million was given in this regard. Overdependence on foreign markets could lead to the economy becoming more exposed to external shocks. And the reason why it did was because it did not wanted the economy to be impacted by conditions in other countries. So it did not want to have negative impacts on its economy due to certain changes occurring in other countries. Switzerland's current account of the balance of payment had been in surplus from 2015 to 2022, so that means it was in a favorable situation throughout these years. Low inflation, along with high quality products, might have contributed to the surplus. Now, what do they say? The two primarily the reasons why Switzerland was able to have a balance of payment surplus for so long was primarily because of these two prime reasons: high quality production and low inflation. A strong currency, however, they also say, could also have kept the cost of raw materials low in Switzerland. That means since its currency was enjoying a relatively stronger situation, that means what? This means imports was relatively low priced, right? And it was earning high. The exports were high, right? High priced. But still, maybe it could be that its products were still in demand, maybe owing to the fact that they were high quality products, or maybe they had an elastic demand in nature, right? But then, whatever the situation was, it was favorable for Switzerland. The Swiss franc, now they're talking about the currency. The Swiss franc, which is Switzerland's currency, is one of the most stable currencies in the world. Now, if you compare the currencies of the world, Swiss franc is on a stronger side. During times of economic uncertainty, the Swiss franc usually strengthens. Now, they say although there might be uncertainty in the entire world, right? However, Swiss franc enjoyed another scenario. It was contrary. That means if the higher the uncertainty, the more stable the Swiss franc was. So what do they say? It has an inverse relationship, an opposite relationship. So even in terms of severe uncertainty, Swiss franc had a favorable situation. Now this is the figure, the diagram given. What does it shows? It shows two key indicators. It shows the global growth rate, percentage change in GDP, how GDP across the globe is changing in percentage wise, and the percentage change in the value of the Swiss franc against the US dollars. And just they have tried to capture how the US franc behaved against the dollar throughout 2018 to 2022. While what is the other indicator? The global growth rate throughout 2018 to 2022. That means how was globally the growth rate occurring, right? And how did the Swiss franc behave? Now they say, although inflation was not high compared to other countries, the Swiss central bank increased interest rates in 2022. This was done to reduce inflationary pressures. However, there was a risk that higher interest rates might increase unemployment. All right. So now they say, although the inflation was not high compared to other countries, however, the Swiss central bank increased its interest rates in 2022. Now, why did it do that? In order to reduce the inflationary pressure. However, there was a risk that higher interest rate might increase unemployment. So now, although the government feared that it might lead to a rise in unemployment, yet in order to reduce the inflationary pressure, it increased interest rate. This means what? Contractionary monetary policy. The rise in interest rates affected some firms negatively. The Swiss government had to organize a merger between the two largest banks in Switzerland in order to avoid one of them collapsing, which might could have reduced confidence in the whole banking system. So, in order to prevent a bank from collapsing, right, from getting default, what it did was it merged the two banks. Otherwise, it could have caused a panic in the financial sector and could have reduced the confidence of the investors and could have given a negative impact, right? A merger might also have helped the merged bank to gain economies of scale. However, the merger resulted in some workers losing their jobs and gave the merged bank greater monopoly power. So, likewise, they shared with us both the scenarios. What the merger did, although it boosted confidence, although it prevented a collapse of a bank, yet what it did was it caused some workers losing their jobs because it might could have led to overlapping of jobs, right? So you might not need certain employees, right? And it increased the power of the bank, giving it monopoly power because it reduced competition, right? So the customers could have then will be a disadvantage, right? So this is what the entire case was about. So now let's quickly look into the questions. All right, the first part, calculate the total financial sector contribution in dollars to Switzerland's GDP. It's a 1 mark question. All you need to do is calculate. What do you want to calculate? The total financial sector contribution to the GDP. Let's look at the table. How much was the financial sector contributing? 9%. 9% of what? GDP. And how much was the GDP? $808 billion. So now let's look at the right hand side. The right hand side shows how I have solved the data response for you. So 9% of the GDP, 9 divided by 100 into the GDP, that is $808 billion. And once you will divide it and you will use a calculator for that, you'll round it off, and the answer that's arriving is $72.7 billion. Don't forget to put the currency, right? Put dollars. So it's a 1 mark question. You show the working, you've written it, straight 1 mark. Part B. Part B talks about identify 2 microeconomic policy measures. So you just got to list it. No need to explain it. It's a 2 mark question. So they have already talked about 2 microeconomic policy measures. Remember, earlier I had marked them for you. They had talked about how they were using both micro and macroeconomic measures in order to put a curve at the price level. So maximum prices, subsidies, both are good to go. So you can talk about maximum prices and subsidies. You just write them down and you get straight 2 marks. Easy? Part C. No, we'll not put in monetary policy because monetary policy is what? A macroeconomic policy. All right. Part C. Explain one reason why overdependence on foreign markets is a disadvantage to the Swiss economy. Now notice it's a 2 mark question. So how will you go about answering this question? You will give one reason and then you will explain it. So 1 mark is for identification of the reason, and 1 mark you will be rewarded by the examiner once you explain the reason identified. Get it? Now, read the question again. Explain one reason why overdependence on foreign markets is a disadvantage to the Swiss economy. Now, why do you think depending on international markets could be bringing in disadvantage to the Switzerland economy? Remember, the disadvantage it mentioned that it did not want to depend on the foreign markets because overdependence was leading to what? Economy more exposed to external shocks. Okay, so this is what we are going to be writing. Overdependence on foreign markets could lead to economy getting more exposed to external shocks. Reason? Because it's going to bring in imported inflation. It could be that if the country depends heavily on imports of certain key raw materials and the prices of those raw materials soar up, so the country is going to have imported inflation then. Switzerland is going to be experiencing imported inflation, right? Because since it's dependent heavily on the imports, because those raw materials are used in its key production, then it could be causing an increase in its inflation. Get it? All right. Or it could also be that if it's heavily dependent on foreign markets, so if there's a shortage of a certain key raw material, then its supply would be affected, its production would get in jeopardy, right? This could also be the reason, the explanation. So any of this explanation for the same reason would be good to go and would be yielding you straight 2 marks. Part D. Part D asks us to draw a demand and a supply diagram to show how a subsidy to solar energy producers would affect the market for solar energy. So now it's a 4-mark question. How is the marks allocated? 1 mark is for drawing of the correct axis. 1 mark is for drawing up initial demand and supply curves. 1 mark is to show the shift of the supply curve towards the right once the subsidy is going to be given to the producer. And 1 mark is to be awarded to you once you either clearly show the equilibrium positions, that means the initial equilibrium position and the new equilibrium position after the subsidy was awarded, or you show the initial P1 Q1 and P2 Q2 price, initial quantity, and the new price in the new quantity after the subsidy is awarded to the producer. So once you show these 4 changes through your demand and supply diagram and you write a one-liner explaining how the change has occurred, you will be awarded 4 marks. Alright, so what you'll do? Let's quickly look at the diagram. The vertical axis is going to display the price. The horizontal axis is going to display the quantity. You will draw a downward sloping demand curve. You will draw an upward sloping supply curve. And E is your original equilibrium position, making P your initial price and Q your initial quantity. Now what happened? Once the subsidy was awarded, we all know that the supply is going to increase. And once the supply is going to increase, the supply curve is going to move towards the right, showing an increase. And that means at each and every price, now more is being offered. As a result, the price is going to fall from P to P1. That is being showed by a downward arrow. The price falls from P to P1 and the new quantity is now Q to Q1. As a result, the equilibrium position has now shifted from E to E1. This could be the explanation given, and likewise we've made the changes and you'll be awarded straight 4 marks. I hope you all are with me and so far things are good. Moving forward, Part E. Part E asks us to explain 2 reasons why Switzerland had a surplus. Now, notice carefully. Explain 2 reasons. It's a 4-mark question. How are you going to be awarded? 1 mark for identification of the first reason, 1 mark for explanation of that reason. The 3rd mark you're going to get awarded after you identify the second reason, and the final 4th mark once you explain the second reason identified. Right? So now think about 2 reasons why Switzerland has a surplus. Remember, they said it was because Switzerland had high quality products and because it had low inflation and because it had a stronger Swiss franc, right? So you could choose any of these 3 reasons. Once you selected any of the 2 reasons, give explanation for any 2 and you will be awarded straight 4 marks. So if I say because it was because of low inflation, you can say that yes, since Switzerland had comparatively low inflation rather than other economies, it means it was enjoying economies of scale. Its average cost was low. That means per unit cost was comparatively low. As a result, its exports were competitive. This means that it was able to enjoy a higher demand for its products and as a result was experiencing a balance of payment surplus. It could also be that Switzerland used to produce high quality products. This means that its products were highly in demand, leading to an increase in exports. And when Switzerland made more exports, it earned more foreign exchange, and as a result, it had a balance of payment surplus. It could also mean that since the Switzerland was able to produce high quality products, it was less dependent on foreign imports, enabling the country to enjoy a balance of payment surplus since exports were more than imports. It was also because Swiss franc was in a stronger position. This means that it was able to enjoy cheaper imports and price of imported raw materials was then low, enabling the country to enjoy a balance of payment surplus. So pick any 2 reasons, give an explanation, straight 4 marks. Part E. Analyze the relationship between the global GDP growth rate and the change in the value of the Swiss franc. Now, it's a 5-mark question. Now, please concentrate because analyze question in section A is very different to questions in section B. It's a 5-mark question. So, there's a way in answering the question. For this, we'll look at this diagram. Now, remember, what we had identified was that even though there was uncertainty, yet the Swiss franc was strengthening throughout, right? So this means what? That higher the uncertainty, the better of the Swiss franc was. So first we'll identify what type of relationship exists. You have to tell what type of relationship exists, positive or negative, inverse or direct, right? You could write any of it. So since higher the uncertainty, better of the Swiss franc was, this means what? Both are moving in opposite direction. This means what? Inverse relationship exists. or a negative relationship exists between global GDP growth rate and change in value of Swiss franc. How will you explain it? You say when global GDP growth rate is falling, the Swiss franc rose in its value. Throughout 2018 to 2022, whenever the global GDP growth rate was falling, the Swiss franc rose in its value, or whenever the global GDP growth rate was rising, the Swiss franc fell in its value. Evidence, then you will talk about, you'll give any reason for that. What makes you say that? You look at the diagram. From 2018 to 2020, now look at this. Swiss franc was rising in value. The dotted line represents the Swiss franc. Now notice, throughout the Swiss franc was rising in value from 2018 to 2022, right? But what was happening to the global GDP? The global growth rate was declining. From 2018 to 2020, it kept on falling. From 4, it reached to almost a negative 3%, right? So it kept on falling. So once you've done these 3 steps till here, you've got 3 marks out of 5. So far, you've been awarded 3 marks. You'll keep on explaining. Now you will say Swiss franc is a stronger currency. Investors, you explain why. Investors find it relatively safe or secure to invest in it, especially during economic downturns. So now you will try to depict the behavior. Why do you think the Swiss franc behaved in this way, in this scenario throughout 2018 to 2020? So you'll say even though there was economic uncertainty in the entire world, yet investors found the Swiss franc their safe haven, right? They found it reasonably safe to invest their money in the Swiss franc, especially during high periods of economic downturns. Why? Because maybe the returns were predictable and less volatile, right? Once you've done that, 4 marks. However, there exists an exception. In 2021 to 2022, what happened? When the global growth was falling, now notice, in 2021 to 2022, when the global growth rate was falling, see, the global growth rate was falling from 6, it reached to around less than 4. Swiss franc was relatively stable. Now, this is where the Swiss franc is. It's at a negative minus 1, it's at a negative 1.8%, right? So it's relatively stable. Why could this be? Maybe because an after effect or a consequence of a pandemic, it also got affected through a worldwide recession. This could be a reason. Get it? So this is how you will answer an analyze question of section A. Part G. Part G is a discuss question. It's a 6 mark. In order to answer a 6 mark question, it's a discuss question, you need to produce in a well-balanced argument. You'll not be awarded more than 4 marks if you talk about only one side of the argument. So you need to give in reasons for and against the statement presented in the question. And you need to brush it off with a conclusion. Though examiners now have changed their stance that they do not require a conclusion, however, it's entirely up to you. I still recommend my students to brush it off with a one-liner statement or a justification. All right. Now the question says discuss whether or not an increase in interest rates would harm the Swiss economy. So now what do you think? Increasing the interest rate would be beneficial or not beneficial for the Swiss economy? So if you say no, increasing the interest rates is not harmful or was beneficial for the Swiss economy, you could say increasing the interest rates meant that the country was able to pull down its inflation rate. That means spending was reduced and the country was able to put a stop to its demand pull inflation, which means it could reach its target, right? What was its target? It wanted its target to of inflation rate of how much did it set up? 2%. Maybe it could achieve in this way. Or you could say having an increase in interest rates meant that people would be saving more, and it could also be that the demand for the Swiss franc would increase, hot money inflows would occur because people would want to make use of higher interest rates and they would want to save and earn higher interest, right? So the Swiss franc would further strengthen this way. It could also be that the cost of production might fall as higher interest rates could reduce the price of raw material. How? Because the demand would fall, so the price of raw material could fall, or maybe the price of fuel could fall. As a result, the cost of production might fall. However, it could be that a rise in interest rate might be harmful for the Swiss economy because once interest rates rise, aggregate demand would fall, economic growth would fall, and as a result, firms would reduce their scale of operation, laying off workers. As a result, it could be that unemployment might rise in the economy. And higher interest rates would also mean that the level of investment would fall. People would find it difficult to obtain loans at competitive prices. They would not be able to expand. Import of machinery would be relatively expensive. Cost of production could rise. Price of goods could also rise. Why? Because exports would get expensive. Current account could surplus could fall. Why? Because cost push inflation might also occur. It could also mean that since aggregate demand is falling, people would be spending less, so the government would be earning less through way of its indirect taxes. And since unemployment could also rise once the firm lay off its workers because the aggregate demand was falling, so the government would also be would be experiencing less earnings through way of its direct taxes because incomes could then be falling. So as a result, overall the government revenue could fall. So the conclusion could be that it might be beneficial in the long run, providing stability to the Swiss franc, but in the short run, it might give rise to unemployment, a higher interest rate. Right? Last question. A merger. Again, it's a 6 mark question. What are they asking us? They are asking, will a merger benefit Swiss consumers and workers? So, this merger between the banks, will it be beneficial for the Swiss consumers and workers? Now they are asking you to analyze the question looking at from the perspective for both the consumers and the workers. Now, do you think when two banks were merging, did it bring in advantages or disadvantages, both for workers and the consumers? Now, if I say yes, a merger was beneficial for both the consumers and the workers, how would I say? For the consumers, the bank merger could have been beneficial because a merger meant better services, wider or larger range of services, investor confidence might increase because larger banks means that the quality of services is increasing, economies of scale is expanding, and more competitive rates, right? For the workers, it could mean that their skilled level is improving. Maybe they are earning higher wages because it could be that the banks are able to increase their profitability. Overall, their efficiency might increase. Now, maybe because they are sharing skills. So, it could be that the workers' efficiency is also increasing. However, it could be that no, the consumers might say that now the bank since have caused a merger so that it has risen in its power, causing it maybe to charge higher prices. Since it's now enjoying a monopoly situation, it might exploit or charge higher prices from its consumers. It could be that the quality of the services might fall since there is less competition now. However, it could also be that the workers might be laid off because some workers might be having overlapping jobs and would be no longer required. It could also be that the bank might could have grown too large in size that it could have been experiencing technical diseconomies of scale. As a result, its efficiency might fall. So the conclusion could be that yes, it can overall improve efficiency and stability, but it might harm consumers if it causes a fall in competition or it rises too large in its market power or it grows too much in its monopoly situation. But it could also be that the merger might enable Switzerland to compete with large international banks because now it is in a stronger financial position, enjoying more capital. So it entirely depends on how you justify your reasoning, right? A well balanced argument, three reasons of both sides, brush it off with a conclusion, explain, and you'll be good to go. I hope you all enjoyed solving this paper with me. Stay tuned, subscribe, share, because I'll be back with more such questions. Happy learning.